Good evening. A very warm welcome to a discussion on the volume 50 Years of Chipko, the Movement and its Afterlives. We will be joined by Professor Mahesh Rangarajan, Professor Kamala Platt, Mr. Ashish Kothari, Professor Usha V.T., Professor Nikhila S., and the editor of the volume, Professor Murali Shivaramakrishnan, along with a video message from Professor Joyita Sen Gupta, who has contributed a chapter on deep ecology and the role of women in Sikkim Himalayas to the volume. 50 Years of Chipko, part of our Landmarks series, commemorates 50 years of the Chipko movement, one of India's most influential people-led environmental movements. The volume discusses its impact, influence, and afterlife in contemporary Indian environmental policies, global cultural narratives and thought, and offers a ringside view of the movement from personal, academic, activist, and critical perspectives. The essays featured in the volume explore Chipko's core themes of environmental justice, community, rebellion, and feminism that continue to resonate through literature, art, cinema, and policy in India and across the world. Let me now introduce our speakers for today. Professor Murali Shivaramakrishnan, who has edited this volume, is a poet, painter, professor, and literary critic. He retired as professor and chair of the Department of English, Pondicherry University, to devote his time entirely to art and literature. His paintings and sculptures have gone on display at several exhibitions in India and abroad, and he has held numerous solo exhibitions of his work. He is the author of Communication and Clarification, 2014, Strategies and Methods Relocating Textual Meaning, 2018, a number of critical essays and volumes of poetry, which include Night Heron, 1998, Earth Signs, 2006, Silverfish, 2016, and Notebook of a Naturalist, 2020. He follows his passion for ornithology and bird photography when he is not painting or lecturing. Professor Mahesh Rangarajan is Professor of History and Environmental Studies at Ashoka University in Haryana. He is also chair of the Archives of Contemporary India at Ashoka. His first book, Fencing the Forest, was published in 1996. His other books include India's Wildlife History, 2001, and Nature and Nation, 2015. His forthcoming books include the co-edited India's Forests, Revisiting Nature and History, and Nature Contested. He studied in the universities of Delhi and Oxford and has also taught at Cornell, NCBS, Jadavpur, and Kriya universities. Professor Kamala Platt's long-standing study, Environmental Justice Poetics, Cultural Representations of Environmental Racism from Chicanas and Women in India, was published in 2023. Her poetry collections include Gravity Prevails, 2022, Weeds Lovers, 10 Years in the Shadow of September, 2014, and On the Line, 2010. She currently teaches creative writing, literature, and film courses, including Chicana poetry, environmental justice poetics, and pen project prison writing online for the School of Humanities, Arts and Cultural Studies in Arizona State University's New College. Her work documents and exemplifies a poetics of crisis and of resistance by chronicling calamities and the persistence of hopeful acts in marginalized places. Mr. Ashish Kothari is founder member of Kalpavriksha. He taught at the Indian Institute of Public Administration, coordinated India's National Biodiversity Plan, and served on the boards of Greenpeace International and India, ICCA Consortium. He helps coordinate Vikalp Sangam, Global Tapestry of Alternatives and Radical Ecological Democracy. He is the co-author of Churning the Earth, The Making of Global India 2012, and has co-edited Alternative Futures, India Unshackled 2017, and Pluriverse, a Post-Development Dictionary 2019. Professor Usha VT was professor and head at the Center for Women's Studies, Pondicherry University, from 2002 to 2017. Her publications include books and scholarly articles in the field of feminist theory, women's discourse, women, and media. Under her guidance, the Center for Women's Studies in Pondicherry University has produced a large number of dissertations and research papers. She has traveled widely in India and abroad, lectured and made presentations in several academic forums as well as non-academic bodies. She has organized a number of seminars and workshops, particularly relating to gender and women's studies. Professor Nikhila S. is professor in the Department of Film Studies, the English and Foreign Languages University, Hyderabad. She teaches and researches in the areas of gender and cinema, filmic translation, and Indian cinema. She has organized seminars, film festivals, and workshops, and presently coordinates an online film discussion forum, Talking Films Online. Her recent publications include an article on the narratorial function of the female journalist figure in New Age Kannada cinema. Thank you to all the speakers for joining us this evening. For our Zoom audience, I invite you to please use the Q&A box for any questions you have for the speakers. And for our audience joining us on YouTube, please use the live chat box to ask your questions. I now invite Professor Murli to chair the discussion.
Hello, everybody. Good evening to you all. Good morning for the overseas scholars, especially Kamala Plath. Uh, Before I forget, let me thank the contributors to this volume. All the contributors, all the people who have devoted their time and effort to bring forth this 50 years of Chipko, the movement and its afterlives. You have been really cooperative because we have sent many emendations and corrections, and you have patiently cooperated with all that and kept to the time schedule. That's really wonderful. So, thank you all. Thanks to the publishers for having brought out this book on time, albeit a bit delayed. That's about all. But they have done a good work, and we have been showcased in the Calcutta Book Fair, in Delhi Book Fair, in Madras Book Fair, and so many other places as well. And I'm told that the people are buying this book, so this is really good. It is reaching the readers. Thanks to you, and thank you to all the panelists for today. We are here because we are talking about this 50 years of Chipko, the movement and its afterlives. This is not a history of the Chipko movement because I remember that when I started work on this, I was just asked to do the work on Chipko. I spoke to a lot of scholars. A lot of people knew a lot of things about Chipko, and they said, okay, this is what it is, this is what that is. But then we are not recreating a history. We are trying to look at the kind of the presence of Chipko, its legacy, and what we have called the afterlives. So we tried to look at, of course, a large portion of essays, large portion of this contributors, articles, chapters are devoted to the practitioners and the mode and method of the Chipko movement as well. But then we have gone beyond that. So we recognize the kind of the importance and significance of the movement, how much it has shaped our present. It has given us a kind of impetus. Personally, I was drawn into this because as a teenager, I recall that, I have heard about the Chipko. I never knew what it was. I didn't even know that it was happening in a particular village. But I knew that, something was happening in the Himalayas, and a lot of women were hugging the trees and they are saving it. And that gave me a kind of impetus to join the Silent Valley movement in my part of the world. That is something. I don't say that the Silent Valley was an offshoot of the Chipko. Of course, there are so many other historical factors which Professor Rangarajan might be able to explore. But what I thought was, at that time as a teenager, the impact that Chipko had in me was tremendous. As a personal kind of, one could dream and one could believe that a small set of women, marginalized people, people who are kind of ostracized, sent to the edges of main part of not belonging to the main part of social strata, they could do something, and they could change the way in which people looked at environment. Perhaps a small regional movement, a small in a small part of the world, I don't think there is any other organized or unorganized movement, which in which this I shouldn't be using this word illiterate or unlettered women were able to change the world. One person can change the world. That is absolutely strange. That is absolutely amazing. And you can see in this volume, we have looked at the impact that Chipko had, or some aspect of Chipko had, the hope and the kind of fervor with which the women could, act, that has carried forth into many aspects of living, into many other movements as well, to the other part of the world, in Chicano movements. And of course, Professor Kamala Plath would be able to explore this a little further, how much this has, influenced us to shape our environmental justice movements as such. Chipko could be seen as political. It has a political statement to make, because it's part of the feminist move. It is subversive. It tries to change the way in which we looked at non-human beings, human beings looking at the non-human world. It has a history. It has been able to bring forth a substantial change in the way in which social history, environmental history has shaped our living afterwards. It has ecological and environmental and economic impact as well. These are all moot points which we have tried to take up in this 50 years of Chipko in this small volume. So, in fact, when the essays started coming in, it was very difficult to organize them and put them in the frame. We have about 13, 14 essays, 14 chapters here. So all I tried to look along with the writers and contributors was how Chipko has come into the mainstream history, economics, politics, women's studies, film studies, art world, and creativity. You know, it still continues. A lot of people ask me, one historian even asked me, are you going to rewrite the history of Chipko? In fact, I had early discussions with Professor Rangarajan, and he was kind enough to give me suitable directions and put me in touch with a lot of scholars. Many of them, some of them even asked me, are we rewriting? Because a lot of, a very extensive studies of Chipko have come about. Are we going to recreate that? No, we are not. We are trying to look at what has Chipko, come to in the 50 years of its afterlife. It shows that it didn't die out. The spirit did not die out. We are living in a present where people, I mean young people, the present day generation, they don't have this kind of passion. Well, I shouldn't be mentioning that, because we are living in a time when the selfies and the sublimation of the self, and people pretending to be happy. Pretensions of happiness are more important than being happy. Pretensions to saving the world are more important than actually working in the field. Ashish Kothari would certainly tell us that in the field as an environmental activist, how much he has to face when he talks to young people, to keep up the spirit of this hope. Chipko has helped us In fact, we can draw it a lot of, we can take home so much from what does Sundarlal Burguna say? It is like, carrying the firewood on their backs and fire in their hearts. This is how the women are depicted. Burguna was one spokesperson. Chanti Prasad was another spokes. I mean, there are so many. As we have tried to explore as many, we haven't been exclusive. We have been inclusive, and that's one of the major aspects of Chipko. We have tried to bring in the political aspects to it. We have tried to bring in the environmental aspects, the philosophical aspects, and other parts as well. So both Chanti Prasad Bhatt and Sundarlal Bahuguna are specifically, what Chipko teaches us. What is the carry home message of Chipko coming from that? One of the essays mentions that Chipko is a kind of enduring legacy of the Indic indigenous values. Chipko has been able to give us a kind of legacy of Indic indigenous values. What is Indic? What are the Indic traditions? What are the Indian traditions? I'm not specifically, although I have spoken about Atman and Brahman, I'm not trying to relegate these things in a kind of foundational or fundamental way. I'm trying to look at what this part of the world has been able to give to the rest of the world and continue to give. And that is something which this legacy of indigenous values and Indic traditions, which is inclusive. It is not separatist. It doesn't have any separation, because that is something which has led us to believe that Chipko, in Gadwali they say Angvada. There are so many terms for Chipko. Chipko is the Hindi term, Angvada is the Gadwali term, and then Apiko is the Kannada term, and Panduranga Hegde would be happy to talk about, that aspect of it. So we can say that, Chipko has, although it is a region-specific move, untutored, unlettered women, unnamed, in fact. Many of them are unnamed. We have devoted this whole book to them. These people have been able to bring in an impact not merely on a region, but on a nation level and at an international level, so that we can talk about Chipko in the present. It has given us hope, and that is something which I think a galaxy of academics and activists and scholars and artists and people from all around the world who have contributed to this volume would be able to tell us in that way. So this is the debate which we are trying to raise. What is the continued relevance of Chipko carrying the firewood in their backs and the fire in their hearts? How it has helped us, how it has shaped the present. And this is something which, this is an open debate, and this is a kind of we don't stick to certain kind of policies and politics, but we have kept it all open. We are trying to look at it as in an open hearted way. It doesn't mean that human beings are the most important things in this world. Human beings are equally important, as important as the non-human world is. The rest of the world, the rest of the universe, the rest of the cosmos, we are equally responsible if we can hold on to that aspect. This is something which we can, what Chipko teaches us and what we have learned from it. And this is something which we are trying to endorse through this volume. Thank you so much for patiently listening to me, and we will carry this debate forward. I am actually eagerly looking forward to Professor Mahesh Rangarajan and Sri Ashish Kothari, and of course, Professor Kamala Plath and Professor Usha, who will be speaking to us about women's studies and feminists and, that aspect of, environment, which she has seen, and Professor Nikhila, of course, who was my colleague in Pondicherry University. She shifted to film studies. She is a literature product, but finally she has moved to her field, which is film studies. So we can look at how the films and documentaries have been shaped and influenced by these unknown women. And of course, one of the things which I should mention is coming across this volume by Professor Kamala Plath. Unbelievably big, kind of large sort of canvas in which she has given the cultural representations of environmental racism from Chicanas and the women in India. The kind of general term itself shows the wide range. Of course, this was not the first time that I came across her work. I remember it was Patrick Murphy long time ago in his magnificent volume, huge tome of literature of nature, where Kamala Plath featured. So these are all the people who have come together to produce this 50 years of Chipko, the movement and its afterlives. Let us all listen to each other. Thank you so much. Now I guess Professor Mahesh Rangarajan, shall I invite you to speak, sir?
Oh, please, no formality. Thank you, Professor Ramakrishnan. I must say it's a very humbling to read this book. And when Professor Krishnan first contacted me, he tried to get me to agree to write in it. I am glad I said no, because honestly, I don't have the depth of knowledge which distinguished writers and editor have on this particular subject. I'm a student of environmental history, and one tries to learn as one goes along. It seems to me that one of the challenges of letting a history student loose in any conversation is that we're bound to say that the answer to any question is long. We're also bound to say that it's complicated. The reason it's long is that the way we think of the past often holds close to the present. And the ways we think of the present day challenges is very critical to how we think of emergent futures. This, of course, leads to questions: whose past, which present, and what kind of future? And the way we tell that story of the past, and the way it is retold, and the way it's heard, and the way it's listened to is very important. And perhaps the term afterlife is appropriate because there are movements, upsurges, protests, rebellions, and in a narrow way to assess them is to look at success and failure. We all recall the school days when we had to write about causes and consequences of a particular movement or rebellion. And in our own history in India, one of the consequences of 1942 was that it was crushed. The other consequence, long term, is it was clear that the British could not face another such upsurge again. So there's a difference between immediate and long term consequences. There may also be unforeseen consequences. And it seems to me that one of the very important contributions of Chipko was that there was a very important awakening in the communities of historians and the social sciences, the humanistic sciences, to the set of issues that were raised. Ramchandra Guha's book, 1989, was a very important book, The Unquiet Woods, and it did a very fine job of locating Chipko in terms of a long series of peasant upsurges against commercial forestry and state forestry. And it also showed that many of the imminent questions that emerged in the movement about the pattern of development, not only about forestry, but associated development, had their roots perhaps in the 20s and 30s, perhaps even earlier, in this region. Some of these very important insights were developed further and also questioned in the work of Dhirendra Dangwal, who showed that nomadic groups, the end of transhumance, Dalits may have also had a very important role in the foothills of the Himalayas. And of course, in 2019, we got a book we'd all been waiting for, the 700-page tome, Hari Bhari Ummeed, Green Hopes. And Shekharda, Professor Pathak, sat down with the translator and worked to convert it into the book, Chipko Movement, A People's History. One of the most important insights is that earlier, a lot of the idea of Chipko was to look at the differences among the Gandhian activists. For instance, Sodarlalji and Chandi Prasadji, who were both associates and who also had significant differences on how to approach these questions. Like all Gandhians, they conducted their debates with enormous grace and tact and patience, which perhaps are not so evident in public life in most countries, including this one today. I say this with deep respect because I think that's one of the most important things to learn from this movement. And Guha had, of course, emphasized the significant contribution of the Vahini, which had a more radical idea about questioning capitalism in a somewhat different way. I still do see Chande Prasadji with his emphasis on local livelihoods at the Dasholi Gram Swaraj Mandal, and Sundarlalji questioning the idea of relentless expansion, which is central to a capital-driven mode of growth. But the Vahini had a different idea of challenging hierarchy much more explicitly. It seems to me one of the more important contributions of Pathak's work is that he brought out the role of of students, of youth, and the Communist Party. And he also showed that the movement had unexpected outcomes. One of the unexpected outcomes, perhaps undesirable, is that the very issues the movement raised about the overfelling, the degradation of the forests, became an excuse for further strictures, as around the Nanda Devi National Park, on the use of these very areas and lands and resources. So there are many questions that have been raised over time. Is it a peasant movement, a forest movement, a women's movement, a hill people's movement, an environmental movement, a people's movement of the mountains and hills against those of the plains? Was it Sarvodaya? Was it Gandhian? And so on and so forth. Was it all of the above and yet something more? It seems that the reason Chipko stands out is not just because of the character of the movement or the nature of the movement or its social base. One of the reasons it stands out, in common with other movements of its time, that period, in India at least, is that it raised larger questions about development and the environment. And it came at a very particular time in India's history. In the early 1970s, there was disillusion with the path that had been taken after 47. And there was disillusionment across the world. There were many movements in the late 1960s for peace, for gender equality, for racial justice, against the denial of self-determination of nations. This was the time there was a great eruption in Vietnam, significantly the same in Czechoslovakia, and so on and so forth. But among these is the fact that 73 was the year which saw the end of the great acceleration, the huge expansion of the economies of the earth from 1945. India and China were not a participant as equals in that transformation, but they definitely also had their share. And in the early 70s, by putting these questions up forth, bringing the question of the environment from the margins to the center, bringing the question of livelihood to the debate of the environment, arguing that you couldn't look at the environment or nature without an issue of human dignity and rights, Chipko had a very important salutary role. It's been argued by others elsewhere that perhaps more than the Jharkhand movement or other movements, which were also very important. After all, this is a vast country. It had 600 million people in the 70s. It has more than twice as many now. There are, as you know, several languages, several cultures. And what is it that makes this particular movement stand out? One reason is, and you can see it in this book, I was just counting, there are 12 authors. They are from about 8 or 9 disciplines. There are 2 practitioners. There are 7 women. There are people from 3 countries. And there are people, interestingly, from 7 states and union territories. They're not all from those states and union territories. Some of them, their mother tongue is not from that state. Chipko captured the imagination. It spoke to something within each of us. It spoke not just to disciplines and individuals and groups. It spoke across the country. And one of the reasons that Gaura Devi, Chandi Prasad ji, Sundarlal ji, several others won such respect, won so many awards, is that there's a term which is very difficult to translate from Hindustani. You know, Chipko Andolan ne logo mein ek chetna jagaya. It awakened a certain consciousness in people. What was that consciousness? We won't get into. It's too complicated. And these 2 slogans, you see, one of them which comes in this book several times is Mitti Pani aur Bayar, Jinda Rehne ke Aadhar, Ye Hai Jungle ke Upkar. I may have got the order wrong. Ashish might correct me. That what do the forests bear? Soil, water, pure air. These are the bases of existence. But the other slogan is very important. आज हिमालय जागेगा, क्रूर कुल्हाड़ा भागेगा, आज हिमालय की ललकार, वन पर गांव अधिकार का अधिकार. The Himalaya will awake, the cruel axe will run away. And there's a distinction between the axe which is wielded for large-scale industrial commercial use and the axe which is wielded for sustenance and local use. And local use includes trade and commerce. It includes collective use of the forest. And the other is very important, that the Himalaya is calling for the control of the forests by people of the village. And this is, I think, enormously significant, because many of the debates that emerged later, the Forest Rights Act 2006, and we are living with those debates, we lived through them, are about the debates about tenure and control. So we come back to that question I began with, which is that what do we think of the past? What are the clues to the present? And in questioning the hierarchies of society and the hierarchies of priority, the hierarchies that shape the pattern of growth and development, can there be a different society which gives primacy to dignity of the individual, but also the well-being of society at large, and has space for other species, for future generations, other ecologies? This is not an easy question to answer. But the fact that we are discussing it, debating it, doing so within the idiom of Chipko, is itself is a contribution, is a sign of the contribution of the movement. I was struck reading the book that some of the contributors echoed the sentiment in the book Gentle Resistance, which is the translation of the memoirs of Chandra Prasad ji. The last 5 pages of that book are very difficult when you read them, because after his long life, he says, what have we come to? He looks at the Himalaya, the construction of huge infrastructure projects and roads, the Uttarakhand as it has come to be, the contractor Raj, where young people are looking for a job as contractor, of Sarkari, of working in government. And you can't blame individuals for that. Always worried about older generations telling the young you're not idealistic. People of the 40s said that to people of the 1960s. And I can assure you, people of the 60s said that to people in the 70s, and so on and so forth. So we don't know. It's not fair to judge another generation. We don't know how we will be judged. And we don't know who should judge whom. But what we can say is that when someone with the sheer experience and longevity of public services, Chandra Prasad ji, raises the question, raised in this volume, that those issues of the 70s that were raised are probably even more germane today. And why are they more germane today? Is that a measure, and I hate to say this, of success or of failure? And I don't think it's only Chipko which is we're raising this question. We're raising it about a larger problematic of our times. I want to compliment all the authors, because it is difficult to take these issues up in the brief space that each of them had. I also want to compliment the publishers, and last and by no means the least, I have to say this first and foremost, of course, should have Professor Sivaramakrishnan for having edited this very fine volume. I also hope it will be translated into several languages so that it will be accessible. It's a wonderful teaching aid. It's very rare one finds an edited volume which is going to go far in the classroom and in discussion groups. Normally edited volumes tend to be full of footnotes and very difficult to read, I can assure you. And this one, of course, passes both the tests. It has depth, complexity, sophistication, and it is also deeply accessible. And that is what the Chipko movement was about. It raised complex questions, and it did that in, saral bhasha, simple language. Thank you.
Professor Kamala Plath?
Thank you. And thank you. Can you hear me okay, everyone? I hope. I am so not only honored, I just feel so wonderful being a part of this. And in preparation for this panel, I read parts of this exquisite book that we are celebrating today, rereading my own words, and for the first time, reading the chapters of my colleagues and my comrades. I recognize quotes that have contributed to my understanding of the Chipko movement for decades, and memories come to mind. In the 70s, visiting in Varpali, in then Orissa, in Mitra Niketan, when we visited our friend Bela Banerjee. I hope you can see this book. It's one that my mother had written, and I really feel her here with me today, although she has passed. And this is part of what has brought me here. I also remember the these were places with projects striving for equity, peace, and nature left untrampled. I remember the holding it up again just so you can see the mural in the painting my friend Mary Agnes Rodriguez did from the mural picture that was from the Kalahandra district of Orissa, Odisha, where my dad came upon this mural and said, "Oh, it's Chipko. I have to take a picture for," and brought it to me. That was in the 90s. As I read, I see images flying about in time and landing in places that are both next to each other and worlds apart. Something like this Zoom discussion today, really. I think of a phrase from a recent poem I'd written for an artist friend who has an exhibit and book of paintings and writings from a native plant garden in a nearby city park where migratory water birds are sunning among sentient cypress that have stayed put for centuries. This Chipko Andalan that began in the Himalayan foothills inspires protection movements across the world, even now, in parks like the one where I wrote the poem in Yanaguana, San Antonio, Texas. Trees have been the sentinels of ecosystems across the world, and for centuries, communities have sought to tell their stories. Generations of Chipko antecedents and activists tell how the trees help supply food, water, and air for forest communities, and how when the trees were cut, ecosystems and communities suffered and are suffering. Trees are the bulwarks of nature's spiritual connections for many of us. People have written reports, essays, poems, and have painted, sang, and danced, embraced the trees with their lives, and even sued the adversaries of the trees and the birds, as is happening now in my city. All of these works and more make up what I write about as environmental justice, cultural poetics, or as my chapter title puts it, Chipko Andalan's eco-cultural forest poetics. That is expressive work created in the interest of communities, eco-justice, equilibrium, and protection from harms and bigotries. Poetics can carry on for centuries and travel continents and even across hemispheres, where people are discerning, making, studying, speaking, painting, dancing, and writing to eliminate environmental racisms and are magnifying the presence of their daily lives, struggles, and successes. This helps form futures we may or may not see in places we might not be. I have honed my interdisciplinary interest in the cultural poetics or poesis over decades by now. Still, publication and book launch of the Chipko 50th anniversary book feels especially timely in a hopeful sense, in that it celebrates a movement that is more spectacular than the devastation it resists and has fought and is fighting against. Time and again, Chipko has addressed what Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King and others following him have evoked as the fierce urgency of now to stand against injustice. Here in the US, federal environmental justice initiatives have been revoked, and the phrase itself has been removed from documents in interest of dismantling equity, diversity, inclusion, and concerns over man-made climate chaos. We need to hear Chipko's history now more than ever before. My essay begins with a reference to a letter in which my father, who I hope is on listening today, describes to my grandma how he had joined in welcoming the Buddha movement to secure land for the landless communities to coastal plain of Orissa. He writes of that movement, they are making a revolution, not at the point of a gun, but at the point of love with satyagraha, the power of truth. This was February 7, 1955. As I write this, my phone dings with posting from a former student on Facebook who has recently joined the Buddhist monks and peace dog Ashoka in their Walk for Peace, a padyatra from Texas to Washington, D.C., which just arrived, I think, this week. This reminds me that upon college graduation in 1982, I joined Japanese monks and their allies in the last week of a walk to New York City for the nuclear freeze. My phone dings again with texts from elders, mostly women, many Chicanas, spreading strategies to defeat money developers who dismiss the lives and dreams by putting profit before people, especially those who come from all parts of the continent and beyond are face to face with the federal government's disdain, detainment, deportation, and endangerment here. My phone dings, spreads word of upcoming actions, and a commissioner planning of a meeting of community leaders united in the resolve to defeat the creation of a detention center to imprison immigrants in our city. These all in the last few days. This week, students in my town and across the state of Texas are walking out of their classes in civil disobedience in support of the movement against ICE and the violence against immigrants and their allies. The students may not have heard of Satyagraha, but they are walking at the point of love with the power of truth. I will conclude with a sentence from the last page of my chapter that suggests why I mention all these examples as connections to the 50 plus years of Chipko, its antecedents, and its afterlives. As Sundula Bahaguna spoke of his mother watering Tulsi daily, the experiences, poetics, and daily actions of women in league with their forest-based ecocultural communities may be among the best guides to mitigating climate disaster and initiating a more just relationship with Earth. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Mahesh Rengarajan, and thank you so much, Kamala. I think I can just call you Kamala after listening to you. You know, for the kind of enlightening way in which you have placed these things in perspective. These are not moot points because we have realized that the movements which happen in the periphery, uh, subversive kind of people's movements which are actually marginalized, which don't appear to have consequence in the mainstream history, eventually move to the center, and they become a more organized and centered. I don't know what is the future of Chipko's influence, but from periphery to the center, from the margin to the middle, that has happened here. I would like to listen to Ashish Kothari, the environmentalist, who has contributed a beautiful chapter on Sundarlal Burguna and his own personal involvement in the Himalayas. Over to Ashish.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Murli, and wonderful to hear Mahesh and Kamalaji. I am probably one of the few non-academics in the writers here, so my presentation is going to focus more on sort of the activist part of what I've learned from Chipko. Firstly, of course, apologies to Murli because he had a hard time getting me to contribute, but I'm glad that I did finally agree. Murli, if it's okay, I'm going to show a few slides because I think it's nice kind of doing a little bit of a visual journey of what some of us have learned from Chipko. Can you tell me if you're able to see this slide full? Can you see the slides?
Yes, yes.
Okay. All right. So my involvement with Chipko, and I think also Mahesh's, you might actually recognize Mahesh in the bottom right-hand picture. Mahesh, see if you recognize yourself there. This is from 1980 and 81. We had 1979, we had actually started as students, we had started a movement to protect the forests, a large urban forest in Delhi called the Ridge, last part of the Aravallis. And in as part of that movement, of course, we were also then in touch with people like Sundarlal Bahuguna and Chandri Prasad Bhatt when they came to Delhi, would encourage us. And we had begun to hear about the Chipko movement also from people like Ram Guha. So we thought that let's use our vacations to actually go and understand what this movement is all about and also enjoy ourselves as trekking through the Tehri Garhwal Himalaya. So this is some of us in 1980 and 81. Now, what was very interesting for us was as we moved from village to village, and spoke and stayed there and spoke, especially with the women who were really the ground force behind the movement in many ways. Until then, actually, we'd only heard about people like Sundalalji and Chandi Prasad. So it was when we got to the villages, we realized that actually most of the movement is led by women. That for us, this was like a huge learning opportunity. It was like opening up our eyes and horizons in a huge way in those two small treks that we did, because here we were from a city environment, talking about protecting trees in the city and so on and so forth, which was important, but it was still a very narrow point of view about what the environment is. When we get to the Chipko area and we speak to these women, we learn that environment is so much more than what we were thinking about, so much more multidimensional. It's nature and the relationship between nature and culture, which all of you have spoken about already. It's the gender dimension, learning that in fact there were many villages where the men were okay with selling off the trees, but the women were the ones who were protecting them for their own material livelihoods, but also their cultural connections, their feeling of being the trees being their brothers and so on. The whole question of development itself, who decides what trees should be cut where and for whom, and whether they should be cut at all or not? Why should somebody sitting in New Delhi actually be taking those decisions? And probably the most important is something I think that Mahesh has also emphasized, the agency of the marginalized, that people who we thought were kind of so-called victims and poor and non-literate and all of that, Murali, you also mentioned that, actually have enormous power if they are able to organize themselves and show that power. And we saw that happening across all the different places that we visited in those treks. That itself remained an incredibly strong inspiration for us as we grew as environmentalists or social activists or human rights activists over the next few years, school, college, and then beyond as we started doing work. But it was also then beyond that because we kept in touch. And one of the, amongst the many movements we kept in touch with was this particular village called Jardhar, which is one of the most senior activists, was very active, Vijay Jardhari. You can see him in the picture there. And that's the forest that they have actually regenerated and protected. It's still very much protected even now. This picture is from 3 decades back. And beginning to understand that Chipko it was not just a point in time. That, of course, at that point in time in the 1970s, at its peak, it was massive and it was very influential, including in changing policy directions in New Delhi. But it stayed well beyond that, especially where the activists were most active and were doing things on the ground in their own localities and their own villages. We see then, therefore, it moving to another arena in the Dehradun district. People who are involved with the Chipko movement fighting against mining. There's a limestone mining in Nahikala, one of the villages where also we went for trekking and then kind of stayed on with in connection with them and helped them to file a case against the mine, which they were successful in stopping. Um, the legacy then continues into the Tehri movement, the movement against the massively destructive Tehri Dam in Tehri Garhwal, which was not successful from that point of view, but it also inspired a whole bunch of other, just like the Narmada movement, the anti-Narmada Dams movement, the Tehri movement also inspired a whole bunch of other movements similarly in India and across the world to question big dams as development and question whether in fact that's the way we want to go at all. um, and then other arenas. And for me, this has been extremely inspiring, this particular one. So Vijay Jardhari, about who I just mentioned, also then began what was called the Beach Bachao Andolan. So it wasn't just him, it was him, Dhum Singh Negi, many people actually who were part of the Chipko movement, saying it's not just forests. We have to look at our own livelihoods, and especially agricultural livelihoods, and what the government is bringing in the form of green revolution, hybrid seeds and chemicals and so on, is not the direction we want to go to. We want to try and sustain our own traditional agriculture, but to also find maybe some new livelihoods based on that. So, for instance, the Beach Bachao Andolan, of course, was about protecting seeds and conserving and continuing to plant them and spread them, but also about maybe some agro produce that could be sold so that some livelihoods could be generated. So you actually see, and I'm just giving a very small glimpse of some of the things that we have been learning from. The Beach Bachao Andolan then actually begins to spread its movement along with Chipko and others to other parts of the hills and the Himalaya, and then begins to connect, just like Sundarlal Bahuguna and others did, connecting the Western Himalaya with Central with the Eastern Himalaya in one of his many famous foot marches. Beach Bachao Andolan and others also begin to connect what's happening to agriculture in the Himalaya, in the Western Himalaya with Northeast, with the South, and so on. And then we see other movements. I think it's already been mentioned. Apico, Murli, you mentioned this in Karnataka, directly inspired by Chipko, the protection of forests in the Western Ghats. You see there actually Chundalal Bahuguna and Pandurang Hegde in that picture on the left-hand side. And then the latest avatar of that, just a few months back, a Chipko movement in Pune, where I live, to protect trees along the river which are being slated for destruction for a so-called riverfront development project. One of Modi's pet projects in Ahmedabad is now exported all across India. And so these riverfront development projects, which are extremely destructive, have also come here. And there was a movement of residents in Pune where climate activist Sonam Wangchukle, who's currently in jail, also joined in. So, and they use the word Chipko in that, right? So these are some glimpses. There are many more. My own piece in the book has a very short part on this journey. It's mostly actually a tribute to Sundalalji, which I wrote when Sundalalji passed away in 2021. So I'm not going to go into that, but to me, people like him and of course Gaura Devi and Chandi Prasadji and many others, Vijay Jardhari, Dhum Singh Negi, Saab Singh, so many others have actually been, and let's not forget Nautiyalji, the sort of folk singer, who was regaling millions of people with his incredible folk songs connecting to the environment. And never to forget Vimlaji, Sundarlalji's partner for a long time. And I've written in my piece actually how that partnership was an incredibly important one, a partnership of equality, much more so than what one sees in public life. So that's sort of some of the glimpses, just a sort of brief idea of the journey and what we've learned. Maybe just a couple of other things and then I'll stop. I think there are two or three very crucial aspects of Chipko, some already focused on by beyond what the ones that Mahesh and Kamlaji have focused on or sort of adding to them. One is, Mahesh spoke about history. And to me, I think movements today, if you look at the protest movements, the resistance movements, the movements for alternatives across the world today, many of them are obviously learning from the legacy of the past, of what's happened in history in terms of movements like Chipko and many others, even before that, 1930s or 300 years back, Bishnoi, and so many others in India and elsewhere. But to me, I think they're also important if one understands them well enough to imagine the future. And again, this is something that Mahesh mentioned. We do a lot of that. So in India, as part of, and globally also as part of global networks and Indian networks, we kind of look at what is the collective vision of the kind of India we want, or the kind of world we want. And we even do visioning like, okay, in 2100, a colleague and I co-edited a book called Alternative Futures, India Unshackled. And the concluding piece of that was a person speaking to all of South Asia in 2100 and talking about how over 100 years, transformations have happened towards much more justice, much more ecological resilience and regeneration, much less political borders dividing us, or actually dissolving the nation state borders and allowing rivers to come free again, peoples to be able to move back and forth, wildlife to be able to move back and forth, the rights of nature, etc., all of that. So that kind of visioning can't be done in abstraction. It actually comes from understanding the history of what movements have done, the history of visioning, the history of dreaming also, that you can see in movements like Chipko. I remember in the first few those treks that we went to, Sundalalji and Vimlaji both actually spoke about their dreams, not just what was happening on the ground and what needed to be done, but also what they felt or wanted the mountains to look like. So that's one crucial thing. And the secondly, I think understanding from movements like Chipko that none of the issues we work with can be single dimension. They're always intersectional and multidimensional. Environment has to look at social justice. It has to look at models of economic development or well-being. It has to look at radical democracy and or the sort of farce that we are seeing with what's called what with so-called liberal democracy these days. How do people on the ground actually take control? It has to look at cultural diversity. It has to look at issues like caste and gender, etc. So these are all obviously none of us can look at them all together, but I think the importance of books like what you've just done, Murli, and so much else that we're trying to do is to say how do we at least learn from each other these different perspectives and not make stupid mistakes. Environmentalists, for instance, have made very stupid mistakes with respect to casteism, and people like Mukul Sharma have pointed this out to us, and of course people from the Dalit movement have done that. Trade unions and environmentalists have often fought with each other, whereas in fact we should be working together. So I think that multidimensional intersectional approach, which we learn also from Chipko, is absolutely important to point to. Let me end by again congratulating Murli and all the authors for this wonderful publication. My one request, if I might add on, sort of end on a slightly critical note, can we please have a cheaper edition? This one at 1100 rupees is not affordable by most students who should be able to access it. Or let's do a free PDF download at some point, maybe 6 months down the line or 1 year down the line. We've done that with all of our books. I'm sure you can persuade I know so many of the Orient Black Swan people are here. Please consider that, because then it becomes way more accessible, especially to young people, than if it is only available at the price it is right now. Thank you, Murli. Thanks.
Thank you, Ashish, for pulling everything together into perspective. It felt as if I was in Terry Goodward with you when you showed those photographs. It was kind of the history of dreaming is amazing. The way you have phrased it. How did I leave that phrase aside? I don't know, because this is a whole history of dreaming which you have focused on, and you have drawn attention to the multidimensional aspects of development, policy making, and decisions, which we have to uh, consider when we look at other aspects like gender, caste, nature. And then this leads us, in fact, to the next panelist in line, Professor Usha, who I hope will be talking about ecofeminism, because ecofeminism asks for a kind of, unified way, not marginalizing, not segregating, not, separation, but it calls for that kind of perhaps a history of dreaming in a different way. And we can look for changing policy decisions. If the non-literate women have so much power, non-identified women have so much power, I'm sure that we can take it forward into a gender just society. uh, uh, Professor Usha?
Well, good evening. I'm almost at a loss right now after listening to all of you. I'm not really sure what I should say, but yes, your point about dreaming, Professor, Mr. Ashish, thank you so much for bringing in dreaming, because it is probably the romance of the Chipko movement, the thrill of the fact that people could work like in the way in which they did, and could bring about results. That was what excited us most about the movement in per se. Especially as a young person, I remember being so fascinated by it, and the fascination has been with me all through. So when I did have to teach a paper on women and the environment, obviously I would think of Chipko first and foremost. And apart from that, we even had Sundarlal Bahuguna visiting Pondicherry University in 2006. Murli invited him and he came over, and it was amazing talking to him. He told us, well, I was the spokesperson for the movement, but what really happened was what Vimla and the others did. Vimla was just sitting there and working with her instruments, and looked as if she had nothing to do with what he was saying. But every now and then when he spoke, she would intercept with some point or the other, which showed her involvement probably more than he was. So here again, we see how women were really the mainstay of the Chipko movement. Though actually, yes, they say, it's not just the romance that I should be concentrating on, maybe, but somehow the romance is what took Chipko to the level to which it has gone. And what was also impressive was the women presence, as so many of you mentioned, not just the marginalized, but also people who seemed otherwise helpless. They were able to come together. Of course, it's just like a mother, fighting for the survival of the child. You find the women coming together desperately, trying to fight for their livelihoods. It wasn't really anything very miraculous or anything very romantic there, but mere fight for survival there that brought them together. But from survival, they drew from so many other things, for instance, legends, folk tales, and they also drew from their own knowledges, indigenous knowledges, which they brought together. For instance, the fact that, if some trees were cut down, it would mean, or if there's an en masse cutting down of trees, that would mean the end of the forest. And that could mean a different kind of environment. That would mean the end of their own livelihoods and also the livelihoods of generations that were to follow. So all these factors, and the fact that they also did not bother about, they were democratic in their whole approach. They did not bother about hierarchies. There were certain periods when the men were enticed out of the village. We hear from the tales in which the men were taken away from the village. Of course, they were more interested in the commercial aspect also, perhaps. But the women came together, and under the leadership of Gaura Devi, I'm told, and they came together and fought, and they used their sense of the sacred. They used their legends, they used their folk tales, they used their myths to bring together people and tell them, look, these trees are sacred. You cannot cut them. Of course, this was not pantheism in the Wordsworthian sense, but a sense of trees and everything natural as something sacred that needs to be preserved if life has to go on in the universe. So this is the way in which, this is something that happened in a small town in the Himalayas, but this is something that has reached out to all of us, not only all over India, but all over the world. And in that sense, maybe Sundarlal Bahuguna and others were very careful to make sure that it reached everywhere. But one thing is that it was not just a movement that went in depth alone, but it also spread all over the place. And it was so democratic in the way in which it spread all over the place that everybody could join the movement, regardless of what their background was, what their knowledge level was, or what their caste or creed or whatever religion they belonged to. All those things did not matter when it came to their own livelihoods or their own way of life. So this is what made this a very unique kind of movement. And the fact that women were in the forefront was also a fact that made it more possible to make it democratic and more possible to make it less hierarchical. There was no need to be patronizing or patriarchal in their approach, because they were all together in it and they held hands and worked together. So this is what made this a very unique kind of movement. And this is what made it possible for it to reach out to so many of us all over the world, and which made us also, echo the same sort of sentiments that we were talking about. It's not as if they were only interested in the environment as such, but they were more interested in the livelihood aspect. And that is what, as Ram Guha called it, it was a peasant movement to start with. That's what he said. But from there, I think it was Bahuguna and his followers who took it more towards the environment, who made it a kind of horizontal movement that spread out with the help of all the songs and the tales and everything, so that it reached a larger number of people. And that it talked about using, of course, Gandhian values, and the fact that they could hug trees, uh, and they did not have to use violence in the traditional sense as protest movements always did. So perhaps it was the women's presence that made all this more possible, or the women dominance, shall I say? Well, again, I don't like to use the term dominance here. A collective, maybe. They work together that way. And that is what made this a very unique movement. And future movements also moved in the same direction, such as the Silent Valley movement, of which probably Murli was the early proponents for those movements, and so on and so forth. So many wonderful movements. And of course, wherever dominance came in, the women came in, walked in to protest. And and the dream continues to be, as we have seen in the afterlives of the movement in this book. So that's all that I have to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Usha, for this from livelihood to the through the legends and folk tales to the kind of where hierarchies were dispensed with, and the importance of passive resistance and how much it is possible to bring in. I didn't mention Gandhi at the beginning. I think all other speakers also mentioned how Gandhi's passive resistance, when he picked up a handful of salt, that was enough. This is a kind of homely thing where we can't live without salt. Now, of course, you have so much of different kinds of salt which is marketed, but when Gandhi picked up a handful of salt, he made a lot of change. He not a trend, it's an absolutely fantastic call for revolution. So by hugging the trees and by bringing in democratic values and using this massive passive resistance, how the women of Gadwal could bring in a kind of international force into the change and movement. Now, in a world where we live in the present, in the digital world, because everything is now technology. I don't know whether AI will take us all over soon, because we don't know. But then the power of the visual, the power of technology on the screen, in cinema, in our small screens which we carry. We are all glowgens in that way, because every day, early in the morning and late at night, the glow falls on our face and we think we are glowgens that way. So through this glowgen generation, how much the power of cinema and what has happened to the cinematic in terms of documentary and the power of Chipko, what is it carried forward? Professor Nikla is a specialist in cinema, so I would like to invite Professor Nikila. Thank you.
First of all, thanks to Professor Murli for inviting me to contribute to this volume, and to Orient Black Swan for asking me to be a part of this panel today. It's 50 years since the Chipko movement, but the issues and questions it raised still endure. The question of rights of people who depend on the forest for their livelihood, indigenous tribes who have a material and spiritual relation to the forest, which has been their home for generations, who in status discourse may be perceived as encroachers, the issue of environmental degradation due to logging and deforestation, and the collusion between the state and capitalists were all questions that I had been researching on and writing about in the context of various films. You're familiar with the popular Kannada film Kantara, which foregrounded a community's deep connect with the forest, the role of the state that often sees this community as adversarial, and the landed exploiter who uses the labor of these landless to aggrandize their power. I had also written about a lesser known Kannada film called Hombanna. This was a film that released in 2017 about a young man harboring dreams of cultivating his own land, even as he and his people provide labor to the landlord and other wealthy people of Hongebailu, a place in Malnad, that is Western Ghats of Karnataka. The film references many struggles of forest-dwelling indigenous tribes and communities and their demand for regularization of their land rights and resettlement in Karnataka. Sai Paranjape's Hindi film called Papiha, which released in 1993, which I'm currently working on, also explores this nexus between the timber mafia and a local landlord exploiting gullible tribals, and there's a brave forest officer as well who virtually risks his all to carry out the task which is assigned to him, that of protecting the forest. All this unfolding before the eyes of a young idealistic anthropologist. So when Professor Murli asked me to contribute to this volume, it was not an area that was completely unfamiliar. So what I have done now is just to chart the way in which I had been thinking about these interrelated questions. But looking for the films on the Chipko movement per se was quite a challenge. I began by contacting Deepa Dhanraj for the film Sudesha. This is by the collective, Yugantar Collective. Most of the other films, I have about 9 films in my corpus, both documentary and short films. And in fact, there is also a short fiction film called Gaura. These were all available on YouTube, which as researchers is our large archive today. I cannot say that my corpus is comprehensive, but I would say it's a starting point for putting together the available films and reading them as, to borrow Hayden White's term, historiophoty, that is history in and through images. The films are over a 30-year period, the first being a documentary made for BBC called Axing of the Himalayas. This was made in 1981. And the last is a short animated film in 2021 that is simply called The Chipko Movement. I have discussed all these films at length in my chapter in this book, and my chapter is titled Eco-Cinema, the Chipko Movement on Film, where eco-cinema is conceptualized as those films that create environmental awareness, which deal with issues relating to conservation of the forests and call for political action. As opposed to just seeing, let's say nature on film. So you might have lots of films with Himalayas in the backdrop. All those don't feature in my corpus. Here, for want of time, I will raise just 2 interesting and interrelated observations. One is about Sudesha, the 1983 documentary by Yugantar Collective, which unlike the other documentaries that I have studied as part of this chapter, is not about the leaders like Sundarlal Bahuguna, Chandi Bhatt, or the so-called outside experts, but it tries to understand the material and discursive context that made Sudesha a part of the Chipko group of women. We see Sudesha's everyday hard life as she has to walk miles to go into the forest for cattle field and firewood. Often she leaves in the morning and comes back late, really late in the evening. So when she reminisces about how she was imprisoned in the course of the movement, she actually says that the days in prison were the best because she did not have to labor for food and everyday needs. So this gives us a sense of how closely the Chipko movement, was tied to questions of livelihood and women's labor. The other is the 1997 documentary about which again I have written in my chapter. This documentary is titled On the Fence. It's as I said in 1997, so there's some time that has lapsed between the movement and this documentary. But it captures a very telling moment about what happened to the women who are part of the movement. The one of the the subtitle of this book is The Afterlives. So what happens to the women who are part of this movement? And also about the politics of representation and mediation. Here are some of their words as we hear in the opening scenes of the documentary. And I'm quoting here from their words. Get us to the Prime Minister, then we'll talk about the Chipko movement. You'll get fame, we won't say anything. We are in very backward areas. The government has put us back. The environment guys have put us back. We are very forward in environment. We have not seen any change. We are here on the street at the crossroad of the movement, and we've been projected all over the world. Everybody with their video cameras flaunted us, messed up our minds, tired out our lips, but we got no benefit. This is Bali Devi, who of course goes on to narrate later in the film what happened 25 years ago. But her words raise extremely important questions about what price people in the movement have to pay, how they feel their life questions were bartered, marketed, made use of, benefited from, while their lives have not materially altered in a significant way from their own self-perception. These are cautionary words to every filmmaker and also every researcher like me who hurries to take their stories out to the world without bringing back anything substantial or relevant from the world to these women. This is a voice of protest against being treated as an object of knowledge production, knowledge being produced about them by others in socially advantageous positions, while they want to be recognized as repositories of knowledge themselves, as we see in Bali Devi's words when she says, the environment guys have put us back. We are very forward in environment. We haven't listened to them enough, is her perception. So on this very important occasion, we've had a set of wonderful talks. I have enjoyed every moment of listening to my panelists today. So on this very important occasion, when this wonderful collection of essays on 50 years of Chipko movement is being released, we need to remember that we are, and this book is, because they were Bali Devi, Sudesha, Gaura Devi, and all those courageous women. Thanks to them and also thanks to all of you for patiently listening to me. Over to you, Professor Murli. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Nikhila, for bringing us this, the collusion between the state and capitalism, and bringing us into a world which is totally different from what we consider as reality. The film's reality, film as representation and mediation with life questions. This is something which we have to. This is a kind of it reins us in and makes us think, pause and think. Uh, uh, Thank you very much. So in fact, there is no end to the kind of questions that we can ask in the context of post Chipko, or how Chipko has made us rethink the way in which we are thinking. There were two other presentations. One, of course, Asuncion from Madrid in Spain. She was supposed to send us a video, but she wrote to me at the last minute that she is now not too well. She has a problem with her voice, and there is a kind of issue which is happening in Europe. And she says, I have a throat infection. Almost everybody is suffering from throat infection that way. Carmen and Asuncion could not join us. Otherwise, we would have had some debates and discussions on the Chicano movement in terms of fiction and narrative as well, because we haven't left out any aspect of our life. And of course, the next one would be Professor Jayita Sengupta, who has given us a paper on Eastern Himalayas in Sikkim and the women's movement in terms of art and representation. But Professor Jayita Sengupta unfortunately had to leave station, so she has left us a video. I think, Namrata, we have a video of. Do we play the video now, Namrata?
Hi, everyone.
Yeah.
A very good
Yes.
evening to all of you. I want to heartily congratulate Professor Shiva Ramakrishnan and Orion Black Swan for bringing out this wonderful collection of essays on the Chipko movement. I recall that last year, January it was, one early morning, Professor Shiva Ramakrishnan had called me and asked me to write something on Sikkim for his book. So I told him that I would like to work on water bodies in Sikkim and how preservation matters. And he said fine, because that is an extension of the Chipko movement. Chipko movement, as we know, and I think the speakers before me must have already spoken about it, began as a women's ecological movement in the Garhwal Hills. But the movement did not restrict itself only to the preservation of forests. It gradually encompassed the whole idea of preserving nature in India, and it's a women's movement. So, my essay, in the context of the Chipko, writes about the anti dam movement in Sikkim. It also talks about women's role in preservation of nature. I also write about the hill people, their customs, codes, belief systems, how they are closely tied up with their life, and how this ancient wisdom is very important and played a very significant role for the preservation of nature, what we could term as deep ecology, as against the shallow ecology which the government is attempting to do for the preservation of nature, because the ancient wisdom had a logic behind it, though it was something that was closely tied up with the idea of sacred in the hills. It was also related to the preservation of resources, maintenance of the resources. So my essay writes about that. And I also talk about the dam movement and the movement that had taken place in 2016 when I was there. It so happened that in the upper Zongo region, there was a huge landslide and a whole village was swept away and a lake was formed. And the governmental decision was to fill up that lake and rehabilitate the people there. However, the people protested because no lives were lost. And ultimately, people's movement yielded fruit and the lake was kept. Why? Because they considered that this was a gift from their god Kanchenjunga, because nobody had died in that landslide. However, things have been very different later, the dam bursts, etc., which was precisely because of man's decision to build dams, and not so wisely so. So things have changed a lot since 2016, but the movement continues. And so my essay talks about the women's role in the preservation of nature in the place, in that particular space in the Himalayas. And it concludes with my painting of Green Tara, Thangka painting of Green Tara, because the primal female deity in Buddhism is also a preserver of nature and environment. I wish this volume a grand success. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks in absence, that way, Professor Jaita. This is her painting which has been depicted here. Chipko has run its roots in terms of culture, region, community, and nation, and its effect has been international. And that perhaps is its afterlife. It is continuing in our midst. Uh, we don't want to make any conclusions in a debate because it's an open-ended sort of discussion. We welcome the participants to come in with their questions. If there are any questions, we have
Yes,
questions? Yeah.
yes, we have a couple of questions.
Yes. Sure.
Because we're running a little short on time, we're just going to be able to take a couple of questions, but they're pretty open-ended ones. So this first question is in two parts and is a general question for everyone. Can grassroots movements like Chipko flourish in the current age of the ultra-politicization of organized movements and protests, partisan hyperpolarization, and an increasing trend of misinformation spread through media and social media? And the second part of that question is, in the context of this increasing state repression, especially of tribal self-determination and the expansion of extractivist capitalism, what viable pathways exist for achieving transformative ecological justice in India? And I think globally also. Big question.
That's quite a complicated question because we live in the time of post-truth, and this is what it has taken us into. So, without mentioning that, I think this hyperpolarization has taken us into this era of post-truth. What is the relevance of environment? I'm sure that Professor Makesh, would you like to unmute?
I was worried about.
Yeah.
I think we should be very cautious about thinking the moment we are in will last forever. This is a very simple point. And, if you looked at the world of the 30s, 40s, it was heading to a cataclysmic war. And nobody would have imagined after 40s that there would be a long period, at least the great powers would not go to war. There were a lot of so-called small wars. 50 million people died in those wars. I'm not underestimating the human suffering, but it was not in the same scale. Similarly, in the 60s, nobody would have foreseen that these issues, gender equity, ecology, would move to the center stage in this way in the 70s and 80s. So we cannot tell what the future will hold. The other is that the regenerative potential exists within people. And on the first, one can say, I would still think as a citizen, I'm confident that the consciousness and reason of the deeper democratic spirit is never to be underestimated. This is the 50th year of the emergency. There's just been a remarkable book on emergency, which is also published by Orient Black Swan, Sethi, and Professor D'Souza. And the thing which stands out in that book is at the time emergency was going on, very few people thought it will be lifted and the transfer of power will come peacefully, but it did. As far as the second is concerned, it's a very serious question, and it is a question the whole world is facing. And I don't think it's only tribal communities. The extraction based model of growth, the pattern of growth, uh, every state on earth is headlong in that process. So one needs to think in a different way. And I will step away because historians are very bad at predicting the future. Whenever we try, honestly, we get egg over the face because we are not competent to do that. So I will step out and I leave it to others.
I would add something more on that because when I thought about the Buddha movement, it brought to mind the land back movement here in the States and other places, and I'm sure you have something similar there, where indigenous groups are buying back, attaining land, and creating a new earth. And I suggest looking at Honor the Earth and their websites to see. That's just one example of this kind of thing. But I think that's where something is actually coming out of the divide that we have and creating a third possibility of something better.
Can I jump in quickly, Murli? Yeah, I think just adding to what both Mahesh and Kamlaji have said, I mean, I think if we look back at the feminist movement and the anti-colonial movements at the time that they kind of began, okay, I mean, it's very difficult to say when they began, but let's say, the first few women who stood up and said, we want equal rights, or the first few movements to throw out colonial countries, late 19th century, etc. You actually see that in the case of the colonial movements, the 500 years of colonialism, which was at least to a large extent thrown out within the space of a few decades, late 19th century, early 20th century kind of thing. No social media to connect them, nothing like that, right? But very, very localized movements actually became like a global thing. And the same thing you can see with the feminist movement. Not that patriarchy is gone, but so many of the most horrible aspects of patriarchy are now in their back. I mean, the fact that many of the panelists and speaker authors today are women are a result of the fact that women stood up and did that. Again, no centralized kind of organizing. It was all decentralized. It became a global narrative, and it still is. I think the ecological movement today is the same nature. Right now, it seems like it's on a back foot, and it is on a back foot. And 100 years back, you could have said the same thing about the feminist movement or the anti-colonial movement. But slowly, these narratives change. What is today small and distributed becomes connected, interconnected, becomes large. It becomes a narrative that everybody has to at least listen to, if not speak, and if not respond to. I feel ecological. When I say ecological, I don't mean narrow environment, and this is why Chipko again is important. I mean ecological, which includes Adivasi rights, people's rights, collective land rights, social justice, changing the fundamental way in which the economy works, and so on. I think that's what will lead us to this, a third, if one was to call, sort of quiet but increasingly global movement. But what I think is very important, last point here, is in relation to the second question, it's absolutely important that movements that are against repression or movements of resistance, movements of speaking the truth, are together, are able to network horizontally without any sort of top hierarchical kind of thing, horizontally with each other, with respect, with each, the sort of unique identity of each being retained, but yet seeing what is common amongst us. What are we commonly up against? The dominant system that we're up against, and what are we commonly for? Just basic values of solidarity, of generosity, of diversity, of love. And the more we can actually fuse these different movements together, not fuse, sorry, connect these different movements together, that is the way to actually be resilient against state repression. Alone, none of us are ever going to succeed. We're going to be wiped out. Together, we stand a much greater chance of being able to continue doing what we want to do and sort of forge the pathways towards getting out of the crises we're in. Thanks.
Perhaps we are running out of time. Thank you so much, Ashish, for bringing us to this kind of, because I was feeling a bit dejected because are we losing hope? You brought back the possibility for the regeneration potential, the care and concern, what I have called in the book, between passion and compassion. If we can bring these together, bring back these essential elements of what it means to be human, to understand what is non-human out there, and then continue this without without letting avarice and greed take over. And that is what has been happening in the development syndrome. Everybody talks about development. What? We don't know. Anyway, we don't want to. I'm so glad that we are, closing this discussion in a kind of positive note. There is still hope for humanity and for life out there. Thank you very much. I guess, Namrata, you may be having a formal vote of thanks.
Yes.
Okay.
But before I get to that, I also wanted to read out Professor Carmen Escobedo from Spain has written in, one of the contributors to the volume has written in saying, this is not a question, but I wanted to thank you for this interesting panel. This is to everyone. And to you, Professor Murli, she says, Dear Murli, I have been listening to you all. I am delighted with the result. This volume is going to transcend frontiers, I'm sure. Greetings from Spain. On that global note of thank you, I want to also say thank you and echo what Professor Murli has said, which is there is hope. And to end on this note of not just end, but the reiteration of standing together. This is how we move forward. This is how we effect change. And this is where hope comes in. Thank you all so much for seeing these very important things that we really need to hear today. And I thank you all for your time and for such an engaging discussion. I'd also like to thank all the members of our audience who've joined in through Zoom and YouTube. We hope that you have enjoyed this discussion as much as we have. Thank you and good night.